Page 75, Hearts and Flowers. After several weeks of hard winter, this end of the county is enjoying a January thaw. Mrs. Dowdle, a lifelong resident, observes that a January fog will kill a hog. That's news notes from our committees, the Piatt County Call, which was a newspaper. We just finished Saturday breakfast when we heard a pecking of sharp heels out on the back porch. Grandma looked up. A shape showed in the steamy window of the back door. There came a fumbled knocking. "Better let her in," Grandma said. It was Mrs. L.J. Wiedenbach, the banker's wife. Fools rush in, and she plunged past me into the kitchen. Grandma looked her up and down. Mrs. Wiedenbach's hat spilled black artificial cherries off the brim. Her upper arm clamped a big pocketbook, and her coat featured a stand-up muskrat collar. Grandma considered the fur with a professional eye. Her gaze fell to Mrs. Wiedenbach's hemline, though she had to peer around the table to see it. This may have been when Grandma saw that skirts were getting shorter. Mrs. Wiedenbach showed a good deal of leg. "I won't keep you, Mrs. Dowdle," she sung out, "as I see you're a busy woman." Having polished off a plate of scrapple and corn syrup, Grandma lolled. "I will cut the cackle," Mrs. Wiedenbach said, "and come straight to the point." Mrs. Wiedenbach never came straight to the point. Her voice dropped. Word will have reached you about poor Mrs. Vatsmeyer over at Bement." "Will it?" Grandma said. Mrs. Wiedenbach clutched a chair back and leaned near. "The change," she said. "If she's thinking about making change, who could blame her?" said Grandma. "Vatsmeyer's no prize." Mrs. Wiedenbach rested her eyes. "I mean, the change of life." She tried not to notice me nearby. "Hitting her hard, is it?" Grandma inquired without interest. Mrs. Wiedenbach clutched her own furry bosom and reeled. "The night sweats, the hot flashes. Of course, it's nothing to what I suffered, but..." Still, I wouldn't go away. I was just off her elbow, hearing every forbidden word. And she was coming to the best part. Her voice fell, and her womb dropped. "Well, do tell," Grandma said. "How far?" "She says it feels like it hit the floor." Mrs. Wiedenbach gave me a cold shoulder because I was sticking like Grandma's glue. But as you know, I never gossip. Grandma lurched in surprise. Coffee jumped out of her cup. "All I'm saying is Mrs. Vatsmeyer is out of the running." A dreadful vision of Mrs. Vatsmeyer trying to run with some of her insides bouncing on the floor almost sent me reeling. So we're up a gum stump about our Washington's birthday tea. It's our sacred tradition to serve cherry tarts to honor General Washington. And as the world knows, there's nobody to touch Mrs. Vatsmeyer for her cherry tarts. Mrs. Wiedenbach's eyes snapped. She is a plain woman, but there is poetry in her pastry. "Who's throwing the party?" Grandma said. "Who?" Mrs. Wiedenbach blinked. "Why, the DAR, of course. The Daughters of the American Revolution, of which I have the honor to be president." The DAR was a club of only the best ladies in town. They all traced their families back to the Revolutionary War, our side. "As I expect you are aware," Mrs. Wiedenbach said, warming up, "my family descends from Captain Crow, who was at Yorktown when Cornwallis capitulated. My mother was a Crow, you know." "Ah," Grandma muttered, "that explains it." "Frankly, Mrs. Dowdle, one of the sorrows of my marriage is that I don't have a daughter, and yes, a granddaughter who will step into my DAR shoes when the time comes." I couldn't help it. I looked down at her shoes. They were high-heeled and a size too small. Mrs. Wiedenbach looked at me bleakly. After all, she had no granddaughter, and Grandma had me. Now she began her retreat because the January thaw hadn't thawed Grandma. "I leave you with this thought, Mrs. Dowdle. The Daughters of the American Revolution maintain a proud tradition of American aristocracy in even as a humble town as our own. Without cherry tarts, we are letting down George Washington. The town is still abuzz about your pumpkin and pecan pies, and I bow to nobody in my admiration of your flaky pastry. I charge you, Mrs. Dowdle, to play your part and come through for us." With that, she was gone. We listened to her pecking off the porch. Silence fell like a benediction. Grandma took her sweet time and then remarked, "Skimpy coat, wasn't it? She's courting pneumonia going around naked to the knee. She wasn't wearing enough to pad a crutch." We sat at the table listening to the icicles drip from the eaves. Finally, I said, "Grandma, are you going to be making cherry tarts for her?" Because we'd need cornstarch and we were about out of lard. But she didn't hear me. "There's different kinds of people in the world," she said. "There's them who'll invite you to join their bunch, and then there's them who'll pay you for your work, and then there's Wilhelmina Wiedenbach." And that seemed to be her final word on the subject. Winter resumes its grip as the younger set at the high school looks forward to an exchange of Valentine cards, and the DAR is abuzz about its annual Washington's birthday tea. The high school will have its big red hearts, but where will the DAR get its cherry tarts? That again is from Newsy Notes in the Community of the Piatt County Call, which was their newspaper. "What's all this about a Valentine exchange?" Carlene Lovejoy said to Irene Stemple one February morning. "Nobody told me about it." Newsy Notes may have been optimistic. There were a lot more girls than boys in school, and none of the boys seemed to be of a romantic nature. Ina Ray leaned over from her desk and pushed her big-eyed little face into mine. Somehow she still looked scrawny and incomplete without her wings. "It says in the paper there's going to be a Valentine exchange," she whispered. "At the grade school, we always made our Valentines. We cut our hearts at our desks and put on lace. Elmo Leeper ate the paste. It was fun. Do you reckon we'll make them here?" "I doubt it," I whispered back. "This is high school." "Well, it beats what we're doing." Ina Ray stuck out her tongue at her history book. The classroom door opened. Principal Fluke stood there with a new boy. The day had been gray but crisp. Winter sun broke through and seemed to find the newcomer. He was as tall as Mr. Fluke and lots better looking. His hair was red gold, according to the sun, and not cut at home. It was razor trimmed over his ears, flat to his head. Forrest Pugh Jr.'s ears stood straight out like open car doors. "Miss Butler," Mr. Fluke said, "I got you a new scholar. Looks like my prayers are answered, and I got me a scoring center for my basketball team." Mr. Fluke pointed to the top of the boy's head. Milton Grider flipped his pencil and slumped in his desk. At 5'9", he'd been the tallest boy in school till now. The new boy seemed to be 6 feet tall. Easy. The back of Carlene Lovejoy's head vibrated. "Name's Royce McNabb," Mr. Fluke said. "His pa's come in as a surveyor for the county roads. His family's down from Coles County way. Mattoon. Let's call him a senior." If Royce McNabb minded hearing his personal history blurted out in front of strangers, he didn't let on. But then he was from Mattoon, which was citified for these parts. And sure enough, he was wearing corduroy pants, not overalls. An argyle patterned sweater strained across his broad shoulders. Ahead of me, Carlene gripped herself. "Be still, my heart," she murmured loudly, and then she leaned across to Irene Stemple and said, "Hands off, he's mine." "Move over, Milton," Miss Butler said, "and make Royce welcome." Royce went through the day with the same smile for everybody. He'd probably been in a lot of schools and knew how to handle himself. When I got home, I told Grandma, we had a new boy at school. She waved him away. "The town's filling up with people you wouldn't know from Adams off Ox. Not like the old days when you knew your neighbors." "The winters are colder back then, too, weren't they, Grandma?" "People starved to death because their jaws froze shut," she said. "You getting interested in boys?" "Who, me?" I said. At that, we heard Mrs. L.J. Wiedenbach fumbling at the back door. When I let her in, there were ice crystals in her muskrat. She elbowed past me, her eyes teary with cold and emotion. Grandma had been over by the Hoosier cabinet. Now she was sitting down, seemingly at her ease. "Mrs. Dowdle, we cannot pussyfoot any more over those cherry tarts." Mrs. Wiedenbach grappled with her giant purse and came up with the Piatt County Call newspaper. "I need a commitment. My hand, it's in the paper now, where it has inspired 2 lines of bad verse." Grandma didn't read the paper, so Mrs. Wiedenbach shook it open and she read. And this is what was in the paper. The high school will have its big red hearts, but where will the DAR get its cherry tarts? Just doesn't that turn your stomach, she demanded. I don't call it reporting, and I don't call it poetry. It's snooping, and possibly by a foreign power. The dignity of the DAR is on the line. Grandma picked a loose thread from her apron front. Mrs. Dowdle, I need your answer before we get any more publicity of this sort. Oh, well, Grandma turned over a large hand on oilcloth. If it's my patriotic duty, I'll bake up a mess of tarts. The wind went out of Mrs. Wiedenbach. She'd been geared up for a larger struggle, more on the lines of the Battle of Bunker Hill. You will? Well, that's real reasonable of you. All in a good cause, Grandma said. Mrs. Wiedenbach turned to go, but didn't make it to the door. On my terms, Grandma said. Mrs. Wiedenbach turned back slowly. We'll have your DART right here at my house. But it'll be handier for me, Grandma said. I don't get out much anymore. That was a whopper, but Mrs. Wiedenbach's head was whirling. Mrs. Dowdle, let me explain. This is more than a social occasion. This is a meeting of the DAR chapter, strictly limited to our members. It's always at my house. I'll fire up the stove in the front room, Grandma said. It'll be warm as toast in there. But, oh, you can serve store-bought cupcakes at your house. Mrs. Wiedenbach crumbled. Page 83. I was at school early on Valentine's Day, but Miss Butler was there before me. Since the newspaper had announced a Valentine exchange, she thought she'd better fill in with a Valentine of her own on everybody's desk. Hers were the flimsy kind that came in a sheet that you punched out, so that was one Valentine apiece. When people straggled in, they found their Valentines. Honestly, Carlene Lovejoy said, rolling her eyes when she saw the Valentine was from Miss Butler. She stuffed it in her desk. Then here came Ina Ray. On her desk beside mine was Miss Butler's Valentine, and 3 more. Ina Ray clasped both hands over her mouth. She squeaked and people turned to look. She was all eyes, and she really was the thinnest girl in the world. She was skinnier than a toothpick with termites. She looked around to see how many Valentines everybody else got. 1 apiece. Ina Ray crept into her desk. Her hands dithered over the paper pile. She made short work of Miss Butler's Valentine. But then she took up the next one. It was homemade to a fault. It looked like it had been whittled, not cut out. The message read, I sent this sentiment in haste, but at least I didn't eat the paste. A secret admirer. Ina Ray stared and then leaned so far over she was almost in my lap. I think that one's from Elmo Leaper, she confided at the top of her voice. Can you believe it? And really, I couldn't. Ina Ray sat straighter in her desk now. Maturely, she took up the next Valentine. It was somewhat better, made with odd little tufts of cotton batting stuck out, and it read, Simple shepherds are we, and too sheepish to say, have a happy St. Valentine's Day. And it was unsigned. Ina Ray gasped. Then she was all over me again. The Johnson brothers. Can it be? As luck would have it, Elmo Leaper and the Johnson brothers were across the hall with Mr. Herkimer. But word that they'd sent Ina Ray Valentine swept our room like a grass fire. It didn't take long. There were only about 12 of us. Carlene Lovejoy looked back in annoyance. Now Ina Ray came to the last Valentine, and I could hardly wait. It really was lovely. A white satin heart padded like a little pillow and surrounded by a double row of paper lace neatly pasted on. Ours to make. Ina Ray cradled it in trembling hands to read. To the sweetest little girl in this room, or any room, from R. Muck-End. Oh, Mary Alice! Ina Ray bounced in her desk. She seemed overcome with self-confidence. Word radiated that Royce McNabb had sent Ina Ray Gage a Valentine. Royce was there too, but seemed not to notice. He always brought an Edgar Rice Burroughs or a Rider Haggard to read before school took up. Word reached Carlene, though. Ina Ray and I watched her vibrate. And then she blew. Out of her desk, she switched and stalked back to us. Let's see that thing. She snatched the satin heart out of Ina Ray's hands, ripping lace. Carlene read the message for herself. Every word burned into her brain. She looked back at Royce McNabb. He sat there with his chin in his hand, reading. Royce was out of reach. Carlene slammed the Valentine on Ina Ray's desk and got down in her face and howled. What have you been up to, you trashy little squirt? A single tear replaced the gleam in Ina Ray's eye. Miss Butler came out of her chair. Carlene, leave the room. So Carlene had to. Royce looked up as she slumped past him. The back of her neck was Valentine red and hot looking. The door closed behind her. It was 8 o'clock on the nose, so we all got up to give the Pledge of Allegiance. Ina Ray lifted her desktop to sneak peeks at her Valentines all morning long, cooing loudly. Down in the basement at noon, when we were eating out of our dinner buckets, all the girls wanted to sit near her, even Irene Stemple. Royce shot baskets by himself down at the other end. He never really was a team player, though he had a nice hook shot. Not that I know anything about basketball. Carlene wasn't there. A smart mouth sent you home in those days. Afterward, out at the pump, Ina Ray sidled up to me. That was fun. Did you see Carlene's face? I can keep the Valentines, can't I? You sure dreamed up some swell messages, Mary Alice, especially R. McN's. They must have taken you absolutely days to make. All in good cause, I said. Ina Ray had played her role well, too. I'd liked the tear in her eye. Then I went to scrubbing under the pump. My hands had been gummy for days. I thought I'd never get all the paste off of them.